Okay, welcome back everyone. So obviously this is my last presentation for this trip, so I thank all of you for the opportunity to be here to discuss these issues with you. And I can't think of a better topic to conclude with than the issue of human capital. So we've talked about a number of things that matter in procurement, but nothing matters more than people. And I'll talk more about that throughout, but this task or this effort to professionalize the workforce, to make procurement a more professional career is not something that can be done tomorrow. It's not going to be done in the next few years, and frankly, it's not going to be done in our lifetime. But it's a journey that we all need to go on together. And like everything else that we've talked about, what you'll see is that the challenges that you face in your country are the same challenges that other countries face around the world. So I'll touch on a number of different issues, but before I do, let's just do some basic principles first, and this should all sound familiar when we start out. Okay, most importantly, one thing that we know for certain is that you can write a perfect procurement law and you can have a wonderful procurement regulation, but that's just words on paper. Your procurement system will either work or succeed or fail based upon the quality of the people and the work they do. So it is important that we have a good procurement law and a good procurement regulatory structure, but the rules are the easy part. The contracts themselves, the relationships, the business decisions all depend upon people. And as we talked yesterday, contracts are relationships. And I think the analogy to a marriage is a good one because relationships are difficult and interpersonal relations are difficult. And doing business is difficult. So what we need to do is learn to have the government and the private sector trust each other based on things that they've agreed to. And trust doesn't appear automatically. We have to earn the private sector's trust, and maintaining that trust is very difficult. Similarly, as we talked yesterday, anytime you have a system that depends upon people, it's going to be imperfect. Some of us are smarter than other people. Some behave better than others. Some are honest, some are not. But human beings are flawed, and we have to work within that system. But more importantly, if you give a human being a set of rules, they may read the rules or they may not. And they may understand them or they may not, and they may choose to follow them or they may not, and they may lose interest or get distracted or not. So again, the words are only as good as how we implement them through people. But particularly now, as you say you're working with something reasonably new, remember, what you're asking people to do is change their behavior. And changing behavior is difficult. You know it in your own lives. You know it from dealing with your children and your friends and your parents. Change is very difficult. And so it's one thing to ask people to change, but it's another thing to ask large professional communities to change their behavior. So culture and change management is incredibly important. The last thing, and this is very important as we talk about professionalization, is one of the most common mistakes that we make in procurement is we basically expect the procuring official to behave a certain way all by himself or herself. And it doesn't work that way. Procurement is a team sport. And most governments don't like to hear that. And a lot of politicians and high-ranking government officials want somebody else to deal with procurement. But we need a lot of people working together. Attorneys, accountants, oversight, engineers, mathematicians, business people, experts. But they all have to communicate and work together. And if we don't convince our procurement professionals that they need to work as a team, our job is even more difficult. Okay, so on one slide, a short list of challenges. My country's challenges, your country's challenges, everyone has the same challenges. And we're never going to fix all of these things anyway. All right, let's just think about them briefly. And this is, again, a short list. First, we have to figure out what we want the normal or the optimal procurement professional to look like. So if I say to you, who would be the perfect procurement official and what skills or abilities or knowledge do they have? That's fun to think about, but more often what we're thinking about is what are the minimum skills or experiences or knowledge that they have. But here's the problem. Once we mandate an educational standard, experience, and training, that becomes the norm or the mean, or it becomes the center toward which everything is pulled. And it may work for some situations, but not for others. So we have to be careful when we set standards. And I'll give you a number of examples of this a little bit later. Okay, next, numbers. And this is just, again, it's bad news, but it is what it is. I have never seen a country that has enough procurement people. And even if you tried to go out and hire and train the right people, then some of them are going to leave, and they're going to retire, and they're going to do other things. But the basic concept or the challenge of finding enough people, getting them into the profession, and then keeping them is a never-ending challenge. One of the things that we were talking about at lunch is in the United States and in many other countries, if you find the perfect person and you train them and they get experience, you'd like to think that you can rely on that person for 10 or 15 or 20 years. But what happens to your best procurement official? The big multinational firms come and hire them and pay them more money, and they get to travel more often and work on more interesting projects. So the better and better your people get, the more attractive they become to other organizations, and particularly the private sector. So we never have enough people, and when we do have enough people, the best people are constantly leaving. I'll give you one more piece of bad news. The best people are the ones who are often leaving because they have better opportunities. What that means is that the worst people are the ones who often stay. So many people stay for good reasons, but a lot of the people who you think are not your top performers will continue to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Okay, once we actually have some people, we have to train them. The easiest training, and I'll talk a lot about training later, the easiest training all deals with learning rules. Do this, don't do that. But the valuable training is all about experiences. Or as we often say, the people who are the best at their job made mistakes and learn from those mistakes and don't repeat them. But the only way you can make mistakes is if you try things. But again, you make a mistake, it's a mistake. But we need to focus on both. We need to share the knowledge, and we need to wait for the people to gain the experience so that they have the skills we need to do the job well. And related to that, mentoring and supervision is incredibly important. As people become more senior, what we need to do is get our best procurement officials and take them out of the buying arena and give them the opportunity to share their experiences and to teach and to mentor rather than just putting them on the next most important contract. All right. Similarly, Incentives and disincentives. By the way, my favorite academic topic in the last decade is behavioral economics. So I like economics anyway, but all of the research in the last 10 to 15 years on how people behave is really fascinating. And so we all have biases and we all see things differently, but we do react to positive and negative stimuli. The biggest problem that most governments have is we can't pay our people enough money. So when the private sector comes and offers a better job, we have no way to keep those people. Similarly, what we want to focus on, to the extent that we cannot solve all of our problems with money, we want to make sure our procurement officials feel appreciated. Another thing that we talked about at lunch today is that in my country and in your country, the media only says negative things about procurement. They only report on the problems and things that go wrong. We need to change that conversation so that people have more job satisfaction, so that they're actually feeling appreciated when they do a good job. And then similarly, what we need to do is through management and supervision and leadership, we need to communicate to our buyers that we want them to make good business decisions and not just avoid mistakes. What that means is when people do make mistakes, we need to permit them to learn from those mistakes and try again. We need to protect them from criticism and punishment and losing their jobs just because they haven't been perfect. All right, so let me spend a few minutes on how we build our acquisition workforce. By the way, how many of you think you have enough procurement professionals right now? Nobody, okay? No organization thinks they have enough people. We're always looking for more people, and when we have enough people, we're always looking for better people. Let me suggest to you one of the common problems that you face. Now, I didn't quite realize this decades ago, but the more that I've worked with other countries, I see the same problem over and over again. Where do you find your public procurement officials? Or in other words, what are the common educational backgrounds that lead people into procurement jobs? If we went around the world, or we brought together procurement professionals from around the world, what we'd find is basically we see a similar background. People come into procurement because they studied or they worked in government. They studied public policy, public management, public administration. They might have studied law, they might have done accounting, but what these young people were experts in is how governments work, how bureaucracies function, how we maintain oversight in governmental institutions. What do they not become expert in? They're not expert consumers. They're not business people. But remember, this is a contract, and there's two parties in the relationship. On the other side, the private sector, these are business people. They've studied business. They might have a master's in business administration. They live in the world of business, and they have to do business with people who are experts in government who often know nothing about business. And many lack economics training, and even worse, many are afraid of the private sector. They don't understand the private sector. They don't really get the culture of the private sector. The worst thing that happens, and I'm not saying this happens in your government, but in many governments, particularly those that have a standard civil service exam, you come in and start working for the government, and as you're really good at your job, you keep getting promoted into interesting jobs. And the people who aren't very good in their jobs get pushed over to procurement. Very, very common. The other thing that I've seen in some countries is procurement is a wonderful place for nepotism hires. My uncle is the prince of whatever, and so I got this job. Bottom line is, very few young people go to high school or college or university or for graduate school saying, I want to be a government procurement official. They're looking to do other things. So we have to make the profession more attractive. But to the extent that most of them come without business experience, I have one tip or suggestion for you. I'll talk more about this later. But if there's only one thing that you try to experiment with in the next 10 years, I encourage you to take your best procurement people and give them exchange programs or rotational assignments where they go and work in the private sector, whether it's for a few months, whether it's for a year, or whether it's for a couple of years. We have a joke that we often tell in the United States about understanding your customer and speaking the language. And what we say is, no one should be permitted to draft a request for proposals or an invitation for tenders if they've never written a proposal or a tender. Think about what a solicitation is. The government asks the private sector to explain to us why they should get a big contract. But if we don't ask the right questions, it's impossible for them to answer the questions in a way that's meaningful to us. And what often happens is that bureaucrats, and particularly arrogant bureaucrats, don't understand how to speak with or communicate with the private sector. They don't know how to communicate or ask the right questions or choose the right words. And so what happens is we don't get proposals or tenders that make sense to us because we haven't asked the right questions. So again, one of the things that I encourage you to think about over time is to experiment with taking your best government officials and letting them go work in the private sector, particularly for the large multinational firms, for some amount of time. Okay, let's talk a little bit then about training. Assuming you have some people or a lot of people, and remember, this is true whether you just hired them and they know nothing, or whether they're already working in procurement and you want them to learn new skills or more skills. There are so many different issues that we have to address. So let me just summarize some of the more common issues that I think we need to think about strategically. So, who are we going to train? How are we going to pay for it? What are we going to teach them? How are we going to deliver the training? And how are we going to know if our training is working? Now, obviously, we could talk about these things for days on end. But if we don't think about them strategically, we don't solve our problems. In other words, what we often see in my country is we decide that we're going to teach a subject, but we don't think strategically about who needs that education now, who's going to learn from that and share that experience with a lesson learned or a mistake they've made, and then how are we going to know whether the training worked or not? And I'll try to keep reminding you that just because you did the training doesn't mean that somebody learned something. In other words, there's the distinct possibility that I may stand up here and talk until 3:30, and the only thing that you remember this afternoon is the article that you're reading on your phone while I'm talking, okay? Now, I'm not going to give a test in here, and I don't know if someone else is either. But just because you deliver the training, or just because you make the training available, doesn't mean the training worked, or that people understood it, or that they retain it, or that they can apply it. One of the most common things that we see is that in the United States, the people who come to our training are excellent at memorizing information. So they walk out of the training and they can say all of the magic words. Or as we say, they're familiar with the content. But they can't use the information that they memorized to solve the problem in front of them, or to creatively avoid the problem next time. And that's why experiential training is so important. So, some of the things that we'll talk about are, you can't really know who you need to train unless you know who you have and who you're hiring and who you're replacing and what skills you're losing. So it's really important to keep track of who the acquisition workforce is. And then remember, everybody doesn't need the same training. Some people need specialized training. Some people need refresher training. Some people need to learn certain skills that others don't. And then, this is hard, another thing to think about is sometimes it's worth training people who don't work for the government or aren't part of what we often think of as the acquisition profession. One example that I'll give you later is that we found it's very, very important to train non-procurement senior officials who are responsible for projects. So heads of agencies, project managers, program managers, because if they don't understand how the procurement process works, they can't do their jobs. Another one to think about is training legislators. Frequently, our legislators write procurement laws that they don't understand, but they don't know what they don't understand because they haven't had any training. They don't know what the words mean. They don't know how to apply them. So it's often really worthwhile to invest some resources to go to your legislature and offer them some training based on things that have worked and things that don't work. Okay, we'll talk about all of these things. All right. Who do we provide training for? All right, now, it's very easy to say, I'm going to train my procurement professionals. In the United States, I have contracting officers. Those are my buyers. I have contracting officers representatives. So they tend to be engineers who also work in procurement. So obviously they need some amount of training, but we also need to train people who are working with them. Couple of examples. Auditors. Obviously here we've talked a lot about the audit function in public procurement. But there's nothing more frustrating than when auditors read words on the page, but they don't understand what they mean in context. So they can't appreciate the difference between a business decision, a discretionary decision, and, for example, a corrupt decision. We want our procurement officials to make good business decisions, but that requires training to understand them. Similarly, I use the term requirements generator, and this term's worth thinking about. In other words, for everything that the government buys, hopefully we're trying to fulfill a need. Where did the need come from and who described it? In other words, you went out and you purchased or you paid for a new road, okay? Who asked for the road? I'm assuming you have a Department of Transportation or a Ministry of Transportation that decided we needed this road in this place. And they draft specifications and basic requirements. But a lot of times what happens is the people who generate the requirement don't understand procurement and they don't work with the procurement people, and that failure to communicate leads to tremendous inefficiencies. So in our experience, when you train the people who are writing the specifications or describing the need, we often work much better together. There's lots of other people who need particular training, but I just want to emphasize a few. What we have found is that engineers need more procurement training. And we often talk about systems engineers, and we think of them as the integrators, the people that make different things work together. And oftentimes, if the systems engineers aren't involved in the process, we might buy a device to work with a system that doesn't fit or is incompatible or inconsistent. So we think systems engineers are very important. Some others, obviously the attorneys are very, very important. And as I mentioned, the legislative and regulatory staff. But we've also found that there's value in training people that don't work for the government. And that can be contractor personnel, particularly small businesses. If you want SME, small and medium enterprise participation, sometimes you need to train them how to do business with you. And we've tried everything over the years. We've done training on the internet. We've brought the small businesses into government facilities. We've hosted fairs. But really, if you want small businesses to participate, they may need some basic training. And similarly, there are so many different things that civil society can do for you, but they may not understand how to speak the language or understand the nuance. Among other things, I spend a lot of time talking to the media because I find that the media tend to write better stories if they actually understand what they're talking about. But normally, people who write stories in the newspapers and on television, on radio, they have no procurement training. All they know is they're unhappy with something. So that can be a good use of resources as well. All right, now, I don't really have time to talk about this today, but as we talk about training, we talk about other issues, I want to pause just for a moment to think about what we call stakeholder analysis or priorities. Trust me when I say that no matter what the topic is, you may have a pretty good understanding of exactly what training needs to be done and who should get the training and what skills should be taught. But if you change your perspective and look at it through someone else's eyes, you may find that you need to train different people and explain things to them differently and take a different approach. And part of the problem is very commonly government officials say, I'm going to train my procurement professionals. But what they don't realize is that's not going to solve the problem if they can't also train the legislators to basically create the tools for these people to do their jobs. And so what we often find is that it's really important to make sure that everybody who's involved in a particular issue understands what we're trying to achieve. Okay. I want to say something that may sound unpopular and may be frustrating. But I think at some level you know this, so I'll just say it anyway. You can't do everything, you can't train everyone, and everyone isn't going to be an expert. So one of the hardest things to do is prioritize where you're going to apply your training resources and your best people. So, I loved the anecdote yesterday. I heard a mayor come in here and say, central government, please don't try to make me behave the way that you do in your central government. I don't have enough people. I don't do that kind of work. I don't have that many transactions. I agree. Not all organizations do the same thing, and we can't expect everybody to do the same thing. I can give you innumerable examples of this, but the best example I can give you is that almost any category that you create, central government, state government, municipality, regional authority, they're just labels. So for example, in the United States, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, these municipalities are larger than many of our states, like North Dakota or South Dakota. If I were to point to China, the 10 largest municipalities in China are all larger than your country. The big cities in South America are all larger than your country. Some are 2 or 3 times the size. So it doesn't work to just say, this is what central governments do, or this is what municipalities do. We have to focus on specific things. Similarly, and this is the hardest, we can't treat all procurements the same. If I had a chart or a whiteboard, the classic line that you see on most procurement budgets is there is a very small number of very expensive procurements. Your biggest infrastructure project, your biggest information technology procurement, something like that. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have staggering numbers of very small procurements. For example, in the United States, we have over 20 million transactions a year that are very, very small. 20 million transactions. We have about 100 transactions that are worth more than, say, $1 billion. That's a lot. You have to decide whether you're going to focus on basically the small number of very high transactions or the lower level ones. And so, for example, we use simplified procedures, we use charge cards. We've decided that we can't impose all of the rules or train enough people to do all procurements the same. You need to make your own decisions with regard to thresholds and priorities. But my personal advice to you is get your very best people and have them working on your biggest, most important transactions. You don't need the same people with multiple graduate degrees, years of training, and years of experience buying office supplies. That's what you should be using your electronic commerce portal for. So we need to be a little bit more careful about allocating our resources and not using a one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, now, if we assume that now we know who we want to train and we know what we want to train on, and I'm not agreeing on that yet, but if we did, where's the money going to come from? In our experience and in most countries, no one wants to pay for procurement training. It's not exciting, you can't see the results, and there's no obvious budget that it's supposed to come out of. If I'm going to train people who are going to inspect roads, that comes out of my transportation budget. But nobody wants to pay for training for the procurement professionals. We also see that when money gets tight, training is often the first thing that gets cut. So we started an experiment a number of years ago, which has actually worked out quite well for us. We went to our legislature and we said, if we're going to do all this procurement, as part of the budget, why don't you put aside a percentage of the procurement budget and let us spend that on procurement training? So, if we're going to do $500 billion in procurement a year, we should be able to have $50 million for procurement training. And that way, the more money you spend, the more money that's available for training. Instead of, we spent more money this year, so we have no money for training. That's what we can't afford to have happen. So, it's been working for us relatively well. Okay. The problem is, once you do have the money, you have to figure out how to deliver it and manage it. Our most successful training is done by, and I'll give you this link a little bit later, we have a Defense Acquisition University. It's a massive organization. It's very, very well funded. So they have a big budget, good facilities, and a lot of staffs. They do some teaching. They outsource some of their teaching. They teach in the classroom, they teach in conference rooms, and they teach electronically through distance education. But our Defense Department has a very big budget, so they can afford it. For our civilian agencies, however, they don't have the same resources. So we created something called FAI, the Federal Acquisition Institute. But the problem is nobody wants to give them enough money, so they don't have enough budget and they don't have enough staff. So what happens is the best training is done by our Defense Department, and the training in most other government agencies isn't very good. I go back to my management issue before. One of the things that's led to over the years is junior people know that the best entry-level jobs are with our Defense Department because they get the best training. Once they've got the training and a little bit of experience, then they go to the civilian agencies because they're better trained than the people who were there. So they get promoted and they get more responsibility. But then the Defense Department has to start training all over again. So it's a little bit of a complicated factor. Now, there's always going to be some people who are going to get private sector degree training. And I'll give you some examples of that later. But as a general rule, private sector degree-based training is very, very expensive. It's also time-consuming. Some agencies say to their procurement people, if you're willing to work on this degree part-time, I'll pay for it. And that works out really, really well. But that's not going to be the solution for most of the people who you need to have the training. You're going to need some kind of centralized organization to do it. Okay, now here's the fun stuff. What subjects should we teach? The short answer is everything, but you can't teach everything. You only have so much time. And the most common mistake that governments make is they train rules. We just passed the new procurement law. Let's train everybody in what the new procurement law says. So they all go and they memorize the contracting rules. It's inexpensive, it's easy, and everybody becomes familiar with it and they can say the magic words. Okay, that's good, but it would be better if we also did a little bit of policy training. Here's what the new rules say, and here's why we did it and what we're hoping to achieve with it. And again, that's a little bit more complicated and is a little bit harder to test with a multiple choice examination. We also need more training in business, accounting, economics, and management. We need our procurement people to be able to communicate and think and negotiate with their private sector counterparts. So they need to understand that language and the approach. Okay, but these are what I consider the basics. The more sophisticated training and the stuff that really has a high return on investment is specialty training. If you're working for my National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and you're working on the space mission, you need to understand the space mission. So remember, who's going to be doing procurement for NASA? Someone who went to public policy school or maybe business school. Why should we assume they know anything about rockets or solid fuel or recovery or how space works? They may need supplemental training in their agency's missions and their technologies. We often forget how little our procurement people know about the agencies that they're buying for. And the more they know, the more they feel like they're part of the team and part of the mission. Similarly, there are specialty markets where specialized training is very important. Two quick examples: information technology and pharmaceuticals. How many people who buy drugs or pharmaceuticals for you, procurement officials, also have a degree in pharmacy? How do they know what they're buying? How do they know whether the generic drug is just as good as the equivalent? Now, you could pair them with a pharmacist, but it's useful if they understand how to read professional literature and how to go to conferences to understand what everyone's talking about. Okay, so this is specialized training. Now we get to the more interesting stuff. And remember, all of this stuff, this training, takes money. It also takes time. So the other training that we consider incredibly valuable, the secondary stuff, but we need more and more of it, are what we often think of as the soft skills. We have found that the more time we spend training our procurement officials in communication, both writing and speaking, the better off we are. Remember, words and the clarity of the words, how clearly you communicate, matters. If you're going to write a contract and the contract summarizes the promises between the government and the private sector, but you're not very articulate and you're not very clear, what are the odds that both parties will actually understand that contract and understand that it means the same things? So we find that the more time we spend training procurement officials in how to communicate, the better they are at their jobs. Similarly, negotiation. Most people who are experts in bureaucracies were never taught to negotiate in the business context. Oftentimes, good negotiating skills require mathematics training, which many people lack as well. But understanding the law, understanding how litigation works in negotiation, very important. And then finally, particularly as our acquisition workforce grows, we need more training in leadership, mentorship, supervision, and oversight. One of the biggest problems that we often have, and you can easily see how this happens. Imagine you hire someone today and they're the best person you've ever had. So once you see them do good work, you promote them and they work on more difficult procurements. Now a really big procurement comes in, who do you turn to? You turn to your best procurement official. Well, one of the hard decisions that we should be making is sometimes not assigning our very best people to working on the contracts, but instead to be assigning them to mentor or train or supervise junior people so that we're building a community and broadening our base. The worst case scenario is when you have a very small number of experienced, talented people and a massive number of people who don't have a path to gain that increased experience. But again, nothing that had you hired to be a procurement professional means that you're qualified to be a leader or a mentor or a supervisor. And identifying the people who are good at motivating young people is really, really important in our profession. Okay, changing gears. Another way to think about professionalization in public procurement is to take what we call the body of knowledge or the core competency approach. In other words, you could bring together a team of experts, maybe over a few months or maybe over a year, and create something that we would call a body of a knowledge that in effect summarizes all of the competencies you want your procurement officials to have. Many organizations around the world have been involved in this process for decades, and they're constantly updating it. Couple things on that. Most importantly, this is really hard, really time-consuming, requires constant review, but it only really works if we get the stakeholders involved. You can't just have government people do it. You need business people too and civil society. But if you could, you might end up with a body of knowledge that says, if you want to be a great procurement official, these are the things that you should basically know. And so in the United States, the National Contract Management Association created a body of knowledge, and they broke the whole world of procurement down into 5 basic knowledge areas. And these are somewhat arbitrary, but think of them like charts or the roots for a tree. So there's what happens pre-award, what happens during acquisition planning and strategy, what happens after award, what about specialized types of buying, and what are the basic business competencies. And underneath these 5 are dozens, and under them are hundreds of specific skills and competencies. And basically, they publish this body of knowledge, and people use it for training purposes or organizing their training. Outside the United States, the most similar model you're going to find is the one by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement Supply. They have a very similar body of knowledge, but the words are a little bit different. NCMA has also gone and had their body of knowledge certified by an independent accrediting organization. Now, having been affiliated with NCMA for decades, we find that a body of knowledge generally lasts about 3 to 5 years, and then you have to tweak it again, because there's always new issues that arise, new technologies, new modalities, new strategies, and the like. One of my favorite examples is the original body of knowledge that I learned from never had anything called electronic commerce because we didn't have anything called an internet. So think how differently procurement is today. I grew up in a world where the government published their procurement notices in a paper newsletter and mailed it out every business day. We totally changed the way we did business with the internet and electronic commerce. But this happens all the time, and it happens today with framework agreements and public-private partnerships and trade and the like. So again, this is one approach. Okay, there's a lot of good things about a body of knowledge, but it's never going to be enough. What the body of knowledge can't do is address skills or experiences. So, I can tell you that I need you to understand this, and it's okay for you to memorize it, but the question is, have you done it? Have you learned from experience? Have you tried it and failed? So, the body of knowledge is knowledge, but knowledge is not experience. Particularly with regard to soft skills. It's possible to memorize all of the rules in public procurement. But if you can't write, and you can't communicate, and you're not honest, and you can't make good business decisions, the knowledge alone isn't going to be good enough. So we really need to focus somehow on soft skills. Let me give you one example that we've been thinking a lot about in the last few years that we didn't talk about 30 years ago. How about this? Stress and time management. We never talked about the fact that at the end of the fiscal year, procurement happens 3 times as fast. And you have to make decisions without getting any sleep. And you might be angry and irritated, and people might be yelling at you. And if you don't have good stress mitigation strategies, you may not do your job very well. And in fact, we have to train government officials to basically ask for help or be honest when they're overwhelmed and they don't have enough time to do their jobs. But that's rarely going to be found in a classic body of knowledge. Another example, working in a team. Sometimes we find, and in your own experiences, procurement officials have a hard time working with auditors, who have a hard time working with attorneys, who have a hard time working with engineers. The only way that we learn to play well with others is by playing well with others. So we need to think about doing training in the kinds of team environments where people are going to do their jobs on a regular basis. We need to teach, think about this for a second, we need to teach procurement officials to have the confidence to turn around to the engineer and say, I heard you say those words, I have no idea what you're talking about. You tell me that you want that technology. That makes no sense to me. I can't explain that to the private sector. They may understand it, but I can't price it or specify it if I don't understand it. That's a unique skill that many of our people don't have. All right, I mentioned this earlier, but knowledge in highly specialized areas, very, very difficult. And if we don't acknowledge that just because you bought a great road doesn't mean that you necessarily know how to buy pharmaceuticals, we can have a problem. Because it's language, it's technology, it's markets, it's vendors. We have to invest in specialized teaching. And what we find is in many, many different markets, That kind of expertise is what makes the private sector firms better, but the government officials aren't able to keep up. Okay. A few words on training. Now remember, I know that your country, like my country, you don't have enough time, you don't have enough money, and you don't have enough people. So what we want to be thinking about is, to the extent that we don't have enough of these things, how can we act efficiently? Or in other words, when do we use classroom teaching? When do we assign reading? Some stuff I can send you an email and say, here's a 5-page article. Read this, okay? Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes I can put 1,000 people in a room and I can explain to them a new rule if it's easy. But sometimes I need on-the-job training. I need you to actually do something and either succeed or fail and have someone looking over your shoulder, and before you make the decision, asking the question, why are you about to do what you're about to do? Do you really understand the ramifications of the decision you're about to make? This brings me back to the issue of rotational assignments and going to the private sector. But remember, there's so many different models for everything. We can teach in the classroom, we can teach on the internet. We can teach with video, we can teach with prepared materials. We can use multiple choice examinations, we can have people write essays. But the question that we have to be focusing on is, what are we trying to teach and how do we know if it's going to work? The really hard thing to deliver, but the thing that really pays big dividends, are skills training, simulations, and problem solving. Bringing a group of people into a room, one procurement official, one attorney, one negotiator, one engineer, one auditor, and saying, I need to fix the problem with this road. What do I do? And have them work it out together. And then what you need to do is change the group and have them work with other people so that they understand that everybody doesn't solve problems the same way. But again, we need to be very open-minded about using different types of training to meet our needs. Okay, changing gears again. One thing that is a really good idea for many states is to come up with some kind of a certification program. In other words, I have procurement officials, but my best procurement officials have a certification. So for example, in the United States, I have a certification called the CPCM. I am a certified professional contract manager. In order to sit for the all-day examination, I had to have a certain number of years of experience, I had to have a certain degree, I had to do a number of other things, and then I had to sit for a national examination. I did that, and I now have a certificate that says I am this type of certified person. It's very, very common in most professions. It's not at all dissimilar from the bar for the attorneys or the boards that medical doctors take. And it is a common coin of the realm in professional communities. Many people think that one of the strongest arguments for certification is it makes procurement officials feel like they're a professional. They know that attorneys had to sit for the bar. They know that accountants had to sit for the certified certified professional accounting exam. They know that doctors had to take exams. They think that if they have to sit for that exam and get a certification, they're a professional, and that gives them pride. And that's actually not a bad idea. But the classic certification model has some kind of a formal application process, requires some amount of training, experience, an examination, and some kind of a periodic refresher every 3 or 5 or 10 years. In the United States, we have private sector certifications. That's the one I have. And we also have a defense certification and a civilian certification. Now, it would be great if we only had one certification. And in the United States, these are actually very similar in terms of what's required. But we have found that, generally, the people who get the certifications are the most motivated, the best trained, and often the best at their jobs. Okay, so there are many, many benefits to certification. One of the big benefits for the individuals themselves is once you have the certification, you become a better commodity in the workplace. If you're looking at two applicants and one has the certification and one doesn't, you almost always take the one that has the certification. So it helps with job mobility. In addition, when you're young, I remember when I was 25 years old, one of the things that I liked about the certification is it showed me the path to being the best. Okay? Everybody I knew who was really good had this certification. They did this, then this, then this, then this. I knew what I had to do. I did it. I got the certification. So there's a certain clarity to the path. In addition, it motivates people. I look at the people in my office who get to work on the best contracts. They have the certification. I want to work on the best contracts. So now I'm going to chase that certification. To chase the certification, I need to work harder. I need to read more. I need to learn more. I need to meet more people. Those are all good things. Okay. But there's some downsides too. Once you lay out that path, that becomes the path. So I could become a certified professional contract manager, but I still didn't learn anything about pharmaceuticals. And if I have to buy pharmaceuticals for a living, the fact that I have that certification may or may not help me. So it's good, but it's not perfect. In addition, certification is expensive and time-consuming. Someone has to write the examination. Someone has to review the applications. And more importantly, people who could be working on procurements are going to be out there studying and taking courses and pursuing that certification instead of doing other things. And then, of course, just like with the body of knowledge, everything's constantly changing. So just because you want a certification program doesn't mean that it's easy or efficient or affordable. Okay, we come back to metrics. If you haven't figured it out by now, I believe that metrics or measurement is really important. So, if you're going to do training, I beg you, figure out whether the training works. And if you don't know before you start the training how you'll know whether you're happy with the training afterwards, I suggest to you don't start the training. Okay? Now, think about your children when you sent them off to the college or the university. What did I want out of my children's education that I paid for? I wanted them to grow up. I wanted them to learn some social skills. I wanted them to be a little more articulate. I wanted them to love learning. Maybe I wanted them to be ready for graduate school. I might want them to have a career. I might want them to be ready for an examination. But we think about what we're paying for with our educational investment. Before you start thinking about the training, it's really important to think about a strategic plan. How many people do I have? What skills do they need? Who needs those skills now? What order should I be training in? When should I be teaching people the soft skills? When should I be teaching them the business skills? When should I be giving them the specialized training? But having a map or a plan, a master plan where someone's managing the community and the training makes a tremendous difference. Okay, similarly, as you think about training, you can incorporate it into your credential process. So for example, as some of you have figured out, in Washington, D.C., in my degree program, my graduate students, after they've gone to law school, after they've gone to business school, can come and study with us for a year to get a degree in procurement. We tell our student that this degree is really good, and it is. But we also tell our students that if they come to our program and they get through the program, they can normally walk in right at the end of the program and sit for the certification exam. So I think I mentioned that I'm a certified professional contract manager. When a student finishes my one-year degree program, I'm confident that he or she can walk in, sit down for that exam, and pass the exam without studying. Because in our program, we've prepared them with those skills. So one thing to be thinking about is you could be looking at your training with an eye towards having your best people becoming certified. And then you get, as we say, you kill two birds with one stone. Okay, but here's the problem once again. What happens when we measure? People perform to the measurement. So it's very, very common for organizations to basically track the number of courses, the number of hours. Who cares? If you went to 6 courses and while you were in the courses, you had your mobile phone following the local football game, and when you weren't doing that, you were shopping on Amazon or Alibaba, then I don't care if you learned anything by sitting in the class, right? I need to know what the learning outcome is. And learning outcomes are difficult to measure. One mistake that we often see is we look for student satisfaction. Did you enjoy the class? I don't care if you enjoyed the class. I need to know whether you learned something. I'm amused to know whether my students enjoyed sitting in my class, but if the student likes me or hates me, it doesn't tell me anything about whether they learned the information or whether they can apply it. And that's another reason why sometimes correlating with certification can really help. Another thing that's fascinating is trying to keep track of how much money you spend or how many days of training. Now it's true, training days tend to not be productive days. People aren't doing the work. But all of this comes back to the point that we need to have a strategic plan for our training. We have a certain number of people. What skills do we want them to have? Who needs the skills? Which skills? And when do they need them? Okay. All of which brings us back to where we started. We know we don't have enough people, but to the extent that we do have a universe of procurement professionals, we really need to keep track of them. We need to pay attention to who we have, what their skills are, what the holes or the gaps in their training or experiences are, so that maybe sometimes we can put them on a different project or rotate them or have them go work somewhere else for a period of time so that they can gain more experience. But it's not just enough to recruit the right people and pay attention to the holes. We need to be thinking about career development so that our people progress in the manner we need them to. Part of the other thing is we often think that our experts don't need attention. Everyone should constantly be getting continuous education in something. If you're the expert in buying roads, maybe you can learn a little bit more about public-private partnerships, or maybe get some training on communications or management or mentoring. But ignoring your people who are already performing well is also a mistake in the short run and the long run. But part of the problem here is we actually have to keep track of all of the people that matter to us. Now, in the United States, we've been doing this for a long time, and every time we look at it seriously, we realize that we're doing an okay job, but we're not doing a great job. It's very difficult to keep track of the number of people. So, it's very easy to know who you hired as a procurement official, and it's easy to know who's working in a job where the title is a procurement official. But if I have a procurement official and the head of that ministry took that person and sent them off to work on a special project, or sent them on a rotational assignment to another agency, or asked them to train someone, or sent them to the private sector for experience, I need to be able to keep track of them. And I need to make sure they have the training they need for their skills, and then I need to watch as they retire or they move. And maybe they moved because their spouse moved, or maybe they moved to a different part of the country to take care of one of their parents who's having some medical issues. But we have to be able to keep track of everyone. So we try to keep track of all of our procurement officials through a couple of central databases, and we try to also keep track of their training, their experience, and their professional development. But what we found is this is also very hard and very time-consuming. Okay, I'm changing gears quite a bit as we get towards the end, but I also want to have you think about what kind of messages we want our procurement workforce to understand about their careers. And we often talk about empowering or strengthening our procurement workforce. We want our buyers to confidently think like business people and make good business decisions. We don't want them to be afraid of making mistakes. We don't want them to be afraid of protests or challenges. We don't want them to be afraid of being fired. We don't want them to be afraid of being criticized by the media or criticized by the legislature, and that's asking a lot. What happens is, if we cannot instill confidence in our buyers, they follow the rules and they don't make good business decisions. So, what we find in experience is nobody likes to be criticized, and the best defense is, I did what the rules said. This goes back to where I started yesterday morning. If you follow the rules, the procurement official doesn't get in trouble. But the government may not get the goods or services they need. They may end up paying too much. They may not get the best technologies. But following the rules is a process, not an outcome. One of the hardest things that we do is coming up with a regime to reward our procurement officials for good outcomes, not for process. In other words, to me, the best procurement official is the one who supports the agency mission. The best procurement official is not the one who simply memorizes and follows the rules. The best procurement official saves the government money, gets the government the best technology, the best innovation, the best service, and the best outcomes. But that may require them to be more aggressive and take more risks. So one of the things we need to know in training is what's possible. What can you actually get away with? But most importantly, we need to connect the procuring official with the outcome. One thing that governments don't do a very good job in is making sure the procurement officials feel like they're part of the mission. In other words, go and get involved with the contractor. See the work that's being done. See the results. See the people who benefit from the work. Or, before the contract, see the people who are going to benefit from the work. And see what problems you're going to solve. But getting procurement officials to identify with the program and feel like they're part of the team, not just an impediment, is really important. Survey after survey, and we survey our acquisition people all the time. What we find out is our people want to do exciting things. They want to buy rocket ships. They want to be involved in exciting infrastructure projects. They want to buy life-saving drugs. They do not want to buy office supplies. They don't want to. They think that anybody can go buy office supplies. They want to buy cutting-edge technology. They want to do exciting business solutions. They want to have creative problem-solving experiences. And so if they can do exciting things, and then if someone says, get ready for it, thank you, You did a good job. Let me share your experience with others. That's what gets them really exciting. Hey, you did a really good job on that public-private partnership. Would it be okay with you if for the next 3 months, I sent you to each of the provinces in this country and had you do half-day seminars in your experience in working on that creative public-private partnership? That makes people excited about what they do. They feel like they're part of the community. They want to do more exciting things like that in the future. And so letting them create case studies and sharing their positive experiences is a great way to motivate them. But we come back to the challenge. At the same time, if we want people to be creative, we have to protect them when they make mistakes. We cannot consistently permit the government or the legislature or the auditors or the media to sacrifice the procurement official whenever something goes wrong. We need to be a little bit better at protecting our people. Okay, so conceptually, I want to close with this one suggestion more than anything else. The least expensive thing you can do to dramatically transform your procurement workforce, not in 10 years, but in the next 3 years, is consistently look for your best people, look for your best contracts, look for your best experiences, and recognize those people. Create an awards program. Find the people who worked on the best procurements, bring them to San Jose, take pictures with the heads of the ministries, take pictures with the president if you can. Get them in the newspaper and celebrate their achievement. It costs you nothing. It makes them motivated to do more. But more importantly, everybody else says, wow, did you see the treatment she got after she worked on that program? I want to be treated that way. How do you get treated that way? You get more training, you get more experience, you get promoted, you work on more exciting procurements. But this is easy. And be creative. There are so many different successful actions that you can recognize. Who came up with the most innovative strategy? Who wrote the most clear solicitation? Who was a good team player? Who got an exciting result? Who got rave reviews in terms of customer satisfaction from the program manager? Who was acknowledged by the private sector as interacting with them and respecting them? Ask your contractors, who are the professionals they most think do the best work? Give them recognition, because people should be recognized for that. There's so many other things. We can recognize people for mentoring or professional development or for publishing case studies or writing articles. And this costs you nothing. This is so much less expensive than everything else that we do, but this is how you create a positive culture so that people want to become better, they want to stay in your organization, they become loyal to the organization, and they believe in the mission. So I can't recommend this enough. Quick story. My favorite example, I think some of you figured out that when I was at the White House, I was there during the second Clinton administration. And some of you may remember that Al Gore was the vice president. And history will probably remember Al Gore most for his being an early voice in talking about climate change. But one of the most creative things that Al Gore did was he created something called the Hammer Award. And I couldn't make this up, but a Hammer Award was a hardware store commercial hammer. At the time, they cost about $4. And they took the hammer and they put it in a frame. And at the bottom of the frame, they put a little brass plaque that talked about an accomplishment. And every quarter, the Vice President of the United States would invite a number of government employees from around the country to come to the White House to stand next to the Vice President and receive a Hammer Award for something they did. The first time they did it, people went nuts. By the second time they did it, they were getting thousands of applications. During the Clinton administration, there was nothing a government employee wanted more than to get one of those stupid Hammer Awards. If you had the Hammer Award, you put it in the hallway outside your office. It was like the Holy Grail. They cost nothing. It was brilliant. It worked. It's easy, but you just have to be creative. You can do something like that, and that's how you transform and motivate and invigorate a procurement workforce. Okay, last point on all of this. You can't fix it tomorrow. As I said at the beginning, you're not going to fix it in 3 years. And frankly, we're going to be having the same discussion at the end of my lifetime. The goal is to just keep moving forward. We want to incrementally improve. How? We try things. Take a hammer and put it in a frame and turn it into a ward. You don't have to use a hammer. You use whatever you want. But try things, okay? Next, in terms of acquisition innovation, my favorite thing in the world is pilots. Run a test. Try something. Say, we normally buy pharmaceuticals this way, but this time we're going to do an experiment and do it this way. But when you run the pilot, make sure you analyze what worked and what didn't, and then learn from that as well. We've had great success with pilot programs over the last 20 years in my country. Having said that, not everything works. So you have to know that there's going to be mistakes, and you have to learn from the mistakes. And a good mistake that helps you avoiding a mistake in the future on a bigger project is a great mistake, because then we can learn as we grow. So what we're really trying to do is grow and evolve, and we're striving for excellence, but we're never going to be perfect, so we have to tolerate our imperfections. All of which brings us back to where we start. Let's get a little bit better every year. A little more training. Hire a few more people. Mentor them. Promote them. Give them opportunities. Motivate them. Recognize them. And then start working on the next generation. And hopefully, when we have this conversation in a few years, we'll be further along. Now, if you end up with the slides later, and I can make the slides available, I have a lot of URLs for some of the training that we've done in the United States, some of our assessments of workplace training. These three organizations in the United States are our acquisition professional organizations. We have a national organization, the National Contract Management Association. That's the one I'm affiliated with. And that's people who work for the central or the federal government. We have a state professional organization, the National Association of State Procurement Officials. That tends to be the 50 states. At the municipal level, we have the National Institute of Government Procurement. All of these are membership organizations. They have certification, they do training and publications. Classic professional organizations. And outside the United States, the best analogy to this again is CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Professional Supply. Okay. Keep in mind, however, that around the world, as you know from your experiences with the World Bank and the IDB and the others, there are many, many institution-building organizations that would love to work with you, including our United States Trade and Development Agency that does training on these very topics. I also mentioned graduate degree programs. I want to be clear. This is a very incomplete list, and they're only examples. But obviously, we do this in Washington, D.C. The University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom is excellent. In Rome, outside of Rome, they have the University Tor Vergata, King's College in London, even as far as South Africa, Stellenbosch University. There are programs everywhere, but look around on the internet and see what the resources are. At the University of Nottingham, they have a wonderful electronic bibliography that has staggering amounts of information on procurement from around the world. One of the things that we do at GW is we support the Social Science Research Network, or SSRN, and you can just Google SSRN. SSRN is a massive database of academic work from around the world, and one very, very small slice of that, under the Journal of Economic Literature, is code H57, and we manage that. There's over 700 articles or papers related to public procurement there, and that stuff's all freely accessible. It's written by scholars and think tanks and governments around the world. We also have a periodic e-journal, if you join SSRN, called Public Procurement, Government Contracts, and Outsourcing. But again, this is a place where academics and government officials from around the world can share information. But the point I want to make again is there's resources everywhere. You're not alone. Finally, once again, thank you for inviting me to your beautiful country. Always a privilege to be here to visit, and I hope to be back again. Good luck on your journey. Remember, you're not alone. We're all in this together, and I hope you continue to make incremental progress. Thank you so much.